Diana Ellis walked into the courtroom to speak her truth, determined to expose the corporate racism that nearly destroyed her life. But before she could finish a single sentence, a white cop grabbed her by the arm, dragging her out like a criminal. No one expected what happened next, because the call that came in moments later wasn't from a lawyer. It was from the Pentagon. What kind of woman gets silenced in court, only to be defended by the most powerful voices in the nation? If this shocks you already, hit that like button and share this video, because what happened next changed everything. The doors of Shady Grove Courthouse swung open with a hollow thud, and Diana Ellis stepped inside. She didn't look around for sympathy. She knew she wouldn't find any. At 42, she'd learned that when you stand up against a system built to silence you, every eye becomes a quiet judge. In her hands, clutched tight to her chest, was the folder. The evidence. 10 years of loyalty to Elstra Media reduced to letters, performance reports, and emails dripping with bias, her truth sealed in paper. A hush rolled across the hallway. Not because they knew her story, but because Lieutenant Bradley Knox had straightened from his post near the doorway. His presence was like a shadow cast too far. Tall, broad shoulders under a crisp white shirt, and that badge polished just enough to distract from the sneer on his face. Figures, he muttered just loud enough. These people always think they can come here and cry racism. Diana stopped. The words stung not because they were new, but because they came so casually, like he'd said them 100 times before. Her voice was steady but sharp like broken glass. These people. Is that supposed to mean me? Officer Knox tilted his head, smirk curling. I'm just saying, lady, courtrooms are for facts, not feelings. Her gaze didn't waver. Then maybe you should step aside. I have plenty of facts. For a moment, the hallway froze. A couple sitting on the bench nearby shifted, as if sensing the air grow heavier. Diana. The voice cut through the tension like a blade. Malcolm Pierce approached his gray suit, slightly rumpled, the kind of man who'd fought enough battles to know you can't win them all, but still fought anyway. He placed a hand on Diana's arm. Don't waste your breath on him, Malcolm said quietly, glancing at Knox. He's not here for justice. He's here to keep people like us quiet. Diana exhaled just enough to loosen the knot in her chest. Malcolm leaned in closer, voice low and steady. You're not here to beg for fairness, he said. You're here to demand what's yours. She nodded, but her grip on the folder only tightened. The heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 3C creaked open. The sound sliced through the hallway chatter. Inside, the air was colder, thicker. Diana stepped in first, the click of her heels like a metronome to the rhythm of her heartbeat. Knox followed slower, his boots thudding like warnings against the floor. At the front of the room, Judge Martha Lewin sat like a monument, rigid, unmoving, her black robe hanging perfectly in place. She didn't look up when Diana entered, not once. As if Diana was already invisible, as if her voice wouldn't matter here. Malcolm noticed and muttered under his breath, She's made up her mind before we've even started. To the side of the judge's bench, a young clerk tapped away at his laptop. Liam Tran, early 20s, sharp haircut and sharper focus. His expression was neutral, too neutral, the kind of face trained not to care. But his eyes flicked up for just a moment as Diana took her seat, and in that split second there was something almost like curiosity, maybe even doubt. Knox positioned himself along the side wall, but not far close enough to make his presence feel like a threat. His arms crossed, his glare fixed on Diana like he was waiting for her to step out of line. Diana scanned the room. Only a few people filled the benches, some lawyers, a couple of bored spectators. She felt their stares like invisible chains. She took a deep breath, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for herself. Every step in here feels twice as heavy. When you're a black woman. Malcolm heard it anyway. He leaned over. Then we make them hear every step you take. The judge's gavel cracked sharp and sudden. Ms. Ellis, Mr. Pierce approach when you're ready. Diana rose, smoothing the front of her suit, but before she could move, Knox shifted a single step forward, deliberate like a dog marking its territory. Their eyes locked. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone steady but ice-cold. Knox smirked. "Not yet." Malcolm stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "Officer, she's my client. You'll respect that." The judge cleared her throat, eyes narrowing. "Mr. Pierce, we have no time for theatrics. Let's proceed." Diana turned, shoulders squared. For a moment the room went silent. No noise, no breath, just the weight of all the eyes waiting to see if she would fold. But Diana Ellis didn't fold. She walked to the front of the courtroom, placed her folder on the lectern, and looked the judge straight in the eye. "I'm here to tell the truth," she said, her voice carrying through the room like a bell. "And I won't be silenced." The silence that followed Diana's declaration was almost respectful. Almost. She took a breath and opened the folder, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear but from the weight of the truth inside. This, she began holding up a printed performance review, is my evaluation from 2022. It says, "I failed to meet expectations in leadership and communication." She paused, letting that settle. But here, she flipped to another sheet, is the original draft, before it was altered. Written by my direct supervisor, noting exceptional team leadership and strong conflict resolution skills. Same quarter, same role. Two completely different stories. From the defense table, James Ridley Elstra's lead attorney, silver-haired, polished like a marble floor, cleared his throat with an exaggerated sigh. "Your Honor, must we go line by line through every subjective document? This is turning into a personal diary." Diana's eyes flicked toward him. "It's only personal when it's uncomfortable for someone like you." Judge Martha Lewin tapped her pen. Not loudly, but sharply. "Ms. Ellis, stick to the scope of the complaint. You are here to prove company misconduct, not argue personal grievances." Diana didn't flinch. "This is misconduct. My record was falsified to justify why I was passed over. 6 times. She pulled another sheet, bold red ink circled names. 6 promotions. All went to white employees with less experience. In some cases, brand new hires. Ridley stood this time waving a hand as if brushing away a mosquito. "Your Honor, again, we're veering into emotional territory. Ms. Ellis seems determined to paint herself a victim." Murmurs began in the back of the courtroom. Someone shifted in their seat. A woman shook her head. Judge Lewin raised a hand. "Mr. Ridley's point stands. Ms. Ellis, focus your presentation on evidence, not implications." Malcolm leaned toward Diana. "You're doing fine," he whispered. "They're pushing you off balance. Don't give it to them." But Diana could feel the walls shifting, not just from their words, from something else. A presence. She sensed it before she turned. There, near the door, in full uniform and stone-faced, stood Lieutenant Bradley Knox. He hadn't been summoned. He had no business here. And yet he walked forward slowly, deliberately, boots echoing with each step, until he stood just behind Diana's bench, arms crossed like a guard in a prison. Diana's hand froze mid-page. The room cooled instantly. "Your Honor." Malcolm stood, voice raised for the first time. "That officer has no jurisdiction here. He wasn't called as a witness or court security." Judge Lewin didn't blink. As a ranking officer, he is permitted to be present. Security must be prepared for all developments. Malcolm's brow furrowed. "This is intimidation. He's standing directly behind my client." The judge glanced up, but her tone remained flat. "He's not obstructing the proceedings." Knox didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Diana slowly turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. Cold. Triumphant. She faced forward again, but this time her voice didn't quiver. "I have a question, Your Honor," she said evenly. Judge Lewin looked annoyed. "That's not your role, Ms. Ellis." Diana ignored her. What do you call it when the person testifying is watched like a criminal by someone with a history of abusing power? Knox shifted his weight, and for a moment it looked like he was about to speak, but Diana beat him to it. Is this courtroom secure, or is it controlled? The room grew pin-drop silent. Liam Tran, the young clerk, looked up again this time, not just with curiosity, but concern. Something was off, and even he felt it. Ridley scoffed, trying to regain ground. Ms. Ellis, now you're dramatizing. Diana stood, full height, shoulders squared. You want drama? Try being escorted out of your workplace by the same officer who ignored your harassment complaint 6 months earlier. Try walking back into a courtroom where your judge knows the CEO socially, your opposing counsel calls you emotional, and your body is being watched like a bomb. She looked straight at the judge. I'm not dramatizing, Your Honor. I'm surviving. The judge's fingers twitched at the gavel, but she didn't strike it. Ridley began. With all due respect, this isn't a stage. No, Diana cut in. It's not a stage. But some people sure seem to be playing their parts. She sat slowly, the room now dead quiet. A subtle tension stretched across the faces in the gallery. Something had shifted. Diana wasn't just presenting evidence anymore, she was forcing everyone to see. Even Liam, still typing now, looked visibly uneasy. Judge Lewin glanced at Knox, then at Diana. We'll take a brief recess, she announced coldly. 10 minutes. Gavel, sharp, final. Diana didn't move, and neither did Knox. But as the room began to stir, a single thought echoed in Diana's mind. They want me quiet. That's exactly why I have to speak louder. The courtroom reassembled with the same cold air. Diana stood once again at the front, her shoulders drawn back, her voice quiet but unshaken. I'm not asking for sympathy, she said, facing the judge directly. I'm presenting the truth. A pause. I've earned the right to speak it. Judge Lewin narrowed her eyes. Your tone is bordering on contempt, Ms. Ellis. No, Your Honor, Diana replied calmly. It's bordering on exhaustion. Malcolm reached for her arm, gently whispering, Careful. But Diana didn't flinch. She turned slightly toward the gallery, toward the people watching like statues, unsure if they were here for justice, or just to watch someone drown. The truth doesn't need to be packaged in politeness, Diana said. It just needs to be heard. And the fact that this courtroom can't bear to hear it says everything. Ridley muttered under his breath. Here we go again. That's when Judge Lewin slammed her gavel. Enough, Lieutenant Knox, remove her from this courtroom. Immediately. A slow, cruel silence spread like wildfire. Diana didn't move. Neither did Malcolm. But Knox, who had been standing in the shadows like a vulture, stepped forward without hesitation. The sound of his boots against the wooden floor felt like gunshots. Diana turned to face him. Don't touch me! But Knox didn't pause. He grabbed her wrist hard, yanking her with a force that screamed of authority misused. She stumbled backward, her heels catching on the floor. And in one sickening public moment, Diana fell. Right there. In front of the judge, the jury, the lawyers, the cameras, the clerk, the people. She hit the floor. Papers scattered. Her folder landed face down. Her elbow hit first, then her shoulder. She winced. Her hair tumbled from its bun. And for the briefest second time, stopped. The sound of gasps rushed through the courtroom. Even the jury flinched. Liam Tran, who had just resumed typing, froze mid-keystroke. His eyes darted to Knox, then to Diana. Something shifted in him, not just confusion, but a quiet, rising disbelief. He had followed the rules, done the job. But this didn't feel like justice. This didn't feel like law. Malcolm jumped from his seat. Don't touch her again. But it was too late. Knox stood over Diana like a warden above a prisoner, not extending a hand, not blinking, not caring. Diana pushed herself up slowly, wincing at the pressure on her wrist. Her voice shook not from fear, but from pain and fury too long suppressed. In this country, she said, facing the entire room, when a black woman speaks with clarity, she is dragged like she's dangerous. Her voice cracked slightly. Even here, where we are told the law is blind. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She stood, spine straightening like steel. You don't want my voice, she continued, because it holds a mirror to the very seats you sit in. Silence again. Crushing. Then, suddenly, bang. The courtroom doors swung open with a loud thud. It was the chief clerk panting, holding a small phone receiver in his hand, his face pale. Your Honor. He started, barely able to breathe. You need to take this call. Now. It's from the Pentagon. Everyone turned. Even Judge Lewin blinked for the first time, showing uncertainty. Ridley furrowed his brows. What? The Pentagon? The judge stiffened. Is this some kind of joke? The clerk stepped forward. No, ma'am. It's verified. They asked for you by name. They asked about Ms. Ellis. Diana didn't move, but her eyes slowly turned and met the judge's. And this time, Diana didn't blink. Liam, still frozen, slowly lowered his hands from the keyboard. Something in the air had shifted. A courtroom designed to silence her just got interrupted by the highest halls of national power. Suddenly, everyone's role in the room felt much, much smaller. Judge Lewin stormed into her chambers, slamming the door behind her. Her heels clicked sharply on the marble floor as she paced for a few moments, lips pressed into a thin line. Then she picked up the court's secured phone and dialed the number the chief clerk had written down, hands trembling, though she tried to hide it even from herself. A voice answered on the third ring. Calm, clear, commanding. This is Colonel Abigail Scott, Department of Defense. The judge blinked. Colonel, this is Judge Martha Lewin from Shady Grove District Court. I was told you... Yes, the voice cut in. We requested to speak with you directly, about Ms. Diana Ellis. Judge Lewin's spine stiffened. I wasn't aware the Department of Defense involved itself in private civil lawsuits. Normally we don't. Colonel Scott replied with a weight that made every word feel measured, but this one touches a matter of national concern. The judge sat down slowly, confusion flickering into panic. I don't follow. You don't have to, Scott said bluntly. But you do need to understand Ms. Ellis is not just another plaintiff walking into your courtroom. She filed a racial discrimination lawsuit against Elstra Media. That's all I know. That's not all she is. There was a pause on the line. Then Scott continued, slower this time, but firmer. In 2014, Diana Ellis was brought into a classified crisis team under federal emergency clearance. There was a breach in diplomatic communications, an intelligence leak that risked the lives of 4 U.S. operatives abroad and nearly exposed joint defense strategies in the South Pacific. She was one of only 3 civilian consultants trusted to manage the fallout. The judge sat frozen. She didn't just help us, Scott continued. She saved us. She held the line between chaos and public confidence, and she did it without ever demanding credit or protection. Until now. I had no idea, the judge whispered. That's the problem, Scott said. Nobody did. That's how she wanted it. But this court, the judge started grasping at what was left of her authority. This court doesn't take orders from the Pentagon. We're not giving orders, said Scott, her voice cooling. We're giving you facts. And one more. The judge's fingers tightened around the receiver. We will not let a woman who served this country in silence be humiliated, dismissed, or silenced in a courtroom for doing the very thing we asked of her back then, telling the truth under pressure. Silence. You asked what kind of case this is, Judge Lewin Scott added. It's a test of whether justice still has a spine when the politics get uncomfortable. Click. The line went dead. Minutes later, the courtroom doors opened again. Diana walked back in, flanked not by guards, but by the chief clerk himself. There was no handcuff, no escort, just a quiet sense that the temperature in the room had changed. The same people who'd seen her dragged out now watched her return, and no one dared whisper. Liam Tran's fingers hovered above the keyboard, but he didn't type. Even he didn't know what to do with what he was witnessing. Judge Lewin entered from her chambers. Her face was paler, her robe looked heavier, and her words came slower than usual. Ms. Ellis, I apologize for the earlier disruption. You may continue presenting your case. Diana stood taller than before. She didn't respond with a nod or a smile. Just silence, calm, composed, and undeniable. Because now everyone knew she wasn't just another woman fighting for dignity. She was someone the Pentagon stood behind, and suddenly the entire courtroom knew. They couldn't silence her even if they tried. She hadn't meant to remember it. But as Diana sat back in the plaintiff's chair, the courtroom buzzing with barely contained curiosity, the past came rushing in like a sharp wind through a cracked window. It was 9 years ago. A government building 4 floors underground, sealed behind security glass and hush orders. Diana had been part of a civilian analyst team, the only black woman in the room as usual. Back then, she believed in systems, believed in silence when it protected people, believed if you followed the rules would protect you too. She was wrong. A file had come across her desk. Internal security footage and email trails implicating a decorated general in an unauthorized transfer of intel, not to a foreign power, but to a private defense contractor his son happened to work for. A leak, they called it. A misstep. But Diana knew what it really was, a cover-up. She didn't speak to anyone at first. She reviewed it twice, then a third time, and then she went to her supervisor. He looked her straight in the eye and said, "Delete it, Diana, and forget you ever saw it." When she hesitated, he leaned in closer. "You're too smart to throw away your future for something that doesn't concern you. Nobody's going to thank you for burning yourself over this." That night, Diana didn't sleep. The next morning, she filed a full report to the Pentagon's ethics division. She hit send with hands that trembled, but her voice when she read the statement aloud was steady. She never saw that supervisor again. But 3 days later, a woman in uniform showed up at her desk without introduction. She simply said, "I'm Colonel Abigail Scott. You did the right thing. You don't owe anyone an explanation. But if they come for you, you call me. No public reward, no promotion, only silence and safety." 2 months later, Diana left the department. Voluntarily. She told herself she needed a change. But the truth was, the price of integrity had worn her down. She moved into media, a different battlefield, one where truth came dressed in ratings and justice had to fight for airtime. And now, years later, she was back in a courtroom being told to shut up. Again. "Malcolm," she whispered now, leaning toward her lawyer who had been silent beside her since her return to the courtroom. He looked at her eyes, uncertain voice low. "You okay?" She nodded once. "Let me tell you something. Back in 2014, I gave up the most promising job of my life to protect people who didn't even know my name." He blinked. "I thought I'd never have to choose between my voice and my future again. But here I am." She exhaled, steady. "Today I'm not giving them the chance to take either." Malcolm sat back. For the first time, he didn't try to coach her. He just listened. And Diana stood. The courtroom wasn't loud, but it buzzed the way air feels just before a thunderstorm. Every step she took toward the witness stand felt like something being restored. Not just balance, not just order, but dignity. The bailiff didn't stop her. Judge Lewin didn't interrupt her. And as Diana reached the stand, something unexpected happened. The entire courtroom rose, not out of protocol, not even out of respect, but something else, something silent and deeply human. Even Liam, the young court clerk who had earlier typed like a machine and looked away like it wasn't his business, stood up slowly. And Diana looked out across the room, eyes steady. "I've been told to sit down more times than I can count," she said, voice calm but clear. "Told to delete the truth, told to stay in line, told to be silent." She glanced toward Knox, who watched her with a clenched jaw. But every time I stayed silent, someone else paid the price. That ends today. She placed her hand on the documents again, the same ones she'd tried to show before being dragged out. And this time, no one stopped her. And just like that, the story shifted. From a case the world ignored to a courtroom holding its breath. From a woman they tried to erase, to the one voice they couldn't. You could feel it shift. Not the lights, not the air, but the room, the atmosphere, the weight of it. Diana stood at the front, a stack of documents in her hand, her voice even but fierce. No shakiness, no hesitation. I have before me a timeline of performance reviews, internal communications, and metadata logs. She tapped the first folder. This was my original evaluation, Outstanding Initiative Cross-Department Leadership Prime Candidate for Executive Track. Dated October 5th. She held up a second sheet. This is the altered version. Dated October 12th. Just 1 week later now I'm combative, inflexible, and suddenly unfit for promotion. She stepped closer to the judge's bench. Your Honor, the file properties show the name of the last editor, S. Ridley. Same man now defending Elstra. Ridley shifted in his chair. Red crept up the side of his neck. He adjusted his tie, leaned forward, and cleared his throat. Objection, Your Honor. Sustained. Lewin snapped, though she didn't look directly at Diana this time. Miss Ellis, limit yourself to factual demonstration. Diana nodded. These are facts. She turned to the projector, clicked a remote. A screen lit up beside her. Timestamps of internal emails popped up in sequence. Each message was worse than the last. We need more polished faces on the front campaigns. You know what I mean. She's a good speaker, but her tone makes clients uncomfortable. Just don't put Ellis in the commercial photos. Optics Ridley. Optics. Gasps echoed around the courtroom. And then quiet. Ridley's voice came again, this time lower, taken out of context, but no one really bought it. Even Judge Lewin's pen froze in midair. Liam, the young court clerk, looked up, visibly shaken. It felt for a moment like justice might crack through the ceiling, until Knox moved. The officer had been standing off to the side, arms crossed, silent, watching. And then he pulled out his phone, sent a single text, and stepped out of the room. 2 minutes later, everyone's devices buzzed. Phones lit up. Reporters whispered. Malcolm leaned toward Diana, eyes narrowing. Then his screen lit up too. He showed her. Breaking ex-government. Staffer. Diana Ellis linked to 2014. Pentagon leak, new evidence surfaces a screenshot of a classified document. Blurred, with her name circled. The title read, Breach Inquiry, Initial Findings, Subject, Ellis D. Diana blinked, her heart catching in her throat. She whispered, That's fake. That document never existed. But it was already out. Hashtag Diana Lies began trending within minutes. Commentators jumped on the story. She's a liar. Another attention seeker. Bet she faked the emails too. Another angry black woman trying to get rich. The courtroom shifted again, but this time away from her. Even Judge Lewin leaned forward, murmuring something to her clerk. Diana could feel it, the unspoken judgment crawling back in. Malcolm stood objecting furiously. Your Honor, this is defamation. This isn't even part of the discovery process. Ridley lifted a smug shoulder. Public knowledge now. Not my fault your client's past just caught up with her. And Diana just stood there, eyes locked on the floor. Not in defeat, but in that suspended moment. That space between breathing and burning. She felt it happening again. The same thing. The system swallowing truth whole. The story being rewritten before her eyes. But in the back corner of the courtroom, Liam had stopped typing. He wasn't watching Diana anymore. He was watching Knox. He had seen him leave, had seen him smirking at his phone. And then it hit him. Liam opened the courthouse security server, pulled up the courtroom cameras. There it was, clear as day. Knox yanking Diana out of her seat just hours earlier, grabbing her arm, slamming her against the wall, her folders scattered across the floor, her voice calm at first, then cracking. "You do not get to silence me. Not again." Liam watched the footage 3 times. Then he pulled out his phone. He uploaded it. No edits, no captions, just the part they didn't show you. It spread like fire. First on TikTok, then Twitter. Then national news picked it up under the tag #JusticeForDiana. By the time the court adjourned that evening, the room felt like a storm about to break. Diana walked out silent. No victory, no defeat, just exhaustion. Outside, a crowd was gathering, some angry, some supportive, all watching. And somewhere in the back of that chaos, Diana whispered to herself, "Truth isn't always enough, but it's the only thing worth standing for." By sunrise, the video had reached 4.2 million views. No captions, no narrator, just a clip. Knox in uniform gripping Diana Ellis by the arm and throwing her onto the marble floor of a federal courthouse. The audio was raw, her voice cracking through the static. "You do not get to silence me. Not again." It echoed like thunder. By 9 a.m., he was suspended. By noon, every major news outlet had run the footage. Headlines screamed across the screen. Black civil rights plaintiff assaulted in courtroom. Federal officer suspended after video goes viral. What is happening at Shady Grove Courthouse? Inside the courthouse, the energy had changed. The bailiffs were quieter. Reporters were louder. And Diana. She walked in like she belonged there. Not out of pride, but necessity. Malcolm straightened his tie, scanning the hallway for any signs of escalation. "We've stirred the hive. Stay sharp." Diana nodded. They wanted silence. Let them hear the truth now. As they passed the courtroom door, a woman stepped out from the shadows. Late 30s, dark-rimmed glasses, auburn hair tucked neatly behind her ears. A government badge hung just slightly visible beneath her coat. Diana stopped. Her eyes narrowed, then widened. Mara Collins gave a faint, nervous smile. "I didn't think I'd ever show my face in this building again. But then again, you always were the brave one." Malcolm looked between them, confused. Diana exhaled. "Mara worked in internal operations at Elstra. I trained her, mentored her. She left right before the smear campaign started." Mara opened her bag, pulled out a thick, sealed folder. 36 emails, internal communications, all between executive staff. Subject line in most of them, "The quiet restructuring." She hesitated, then added, voice trembling, they called it performance realignment. But it was racial culling. You were the first. They just didn't think you'd fight back. The folder hit the courtroom bench like a gavel. Judge Lewin stared at it, then at Diana. "You intend to introduce this?" Now Diana didn't flinch. "It's no longer just about me. It never was." Malcolm stepped in. "We motion for immediate inclusion under new evidence. Emails confirm direct racial bias in staffing decisions, potentially criminal." Lewin looked paler than usual. Her fingers tapped the bench. Once. Twice. But then something unexpected happened. Ridley stood up, collected his notes, and calmly said, "Your Honor, Elstra Media is withdrawing from the defense." The room froze. "I've been instructed to step back," he continued, effective immediately. "The company will settle." Murmurs exploded like sparks. Reporters typed faster. Flashbulbs blinked. Lewin stared at him, jaw tightening. "What kind of legal theater is this?" she muttered. Then someone leaned into her, the court's chief clerk. A whisper was exchanged. Her face fell. She cleared her throat. "I am recusing myself from further proceedings, for personal reasons." She didn't look at Diana, didn't even say her name. She just gathered her robe and walked out quickly, like the room was collapsing around her. Outside, the news vans were already in place. Inside, the courtroom had turned into a newsroom. Malcolm leaned over to Diana, eyes alight. You just pulled down a judge, forced a corporate retreat, and exposed a police officer. All before lunch. Diana smiled, but it was faint. Measured, as if she didn't quite trust the moment yet. I didn't want revenge, she whispered. I just wanted the truth to matter. Malcolm nodded. It does now. You didn't just fight for yourself. You're pulling the rod out from under this entire system. Later that afternoon, the CEO of Elstra held a press conference. We were unaware of the internal misconduct. Effective immediately, our board of directors has mandated a full executive restructuring. Investors called it a crisis response. Viewers called it long overdue. Diana. She called it not enough, because she knew systems don't change in a day, but they crack. And cracks let the light in. Outside the courthouse, a young intern approached her. Miss Ellis, how did you keep going? After everything. Diana paused, looked out at the street, the flashing lights, the murmurs of protesters now chanting her name. I didn't fight because I knew I'd win, she said softly. I fought because not fighting meant letting them define me. She turned. And I've spent my whole life undoing the stories they tried to write for me. Diana sat in the green room beneath the studio lights. She wasn't wearing designer clothes or media polish, just a soft blue blouse and a quiet, steady look in her eyes. Across from her, the talk show host leaned forward. You've become a national figure, Ms. Ellis, a voice for justice. What does that mean to you? Diana took a breath. Held it, then said calmly, I never wanted to be a symbol. She looked straight into the camera, not angry, not triumphant, but I also knew I couldn't stay silent, not when silence is what let this happen. That clip aired on 3 networks. In the days that followed, protesters stood outside courthouses holding signs that simply read, I won't be quiet. An op-ed in The Atlantic called Diana, a mirror held up to a cracked system. And somewhere in a quiet apartment, not far from Shady Grove, Liam Tron was writing a letter. Dear Ms. Ellis, I used to think being neutral meant being professional. That if I followed procedure, I couldn't be blamed. But now I see it wasn't neutrality. It was avoidance. You stood up in a room full of people trained to ignore you and made us see. Thank you for not letting me stay who I was. He didn't sign it with his title, just Liam. Malcolm Pierce stood at a lectern 3 weeks later, addressing a class of first-year law students. Behind him, a projected slide read, Ethics in Law Beyond the Verdict. I've spent 20 years in this field, he said, thinking my job was to protect clients, win cases, outmaneuver the opposition. He paused. But justice is more than a strategy. It's knowing when silence helps power and when it destroys people. He didn't mention Diana by name. He didn't need to. Every student there had followed the trial, and every student knew whose fire had sparked that course. Meanwhile, Diana was busy with blueprints, not courtroom sketches, community plans. She'd used her settlement from Elstra not for herself, but for something bigger. The Ellis Center for Equity and Voice. A space dedicated to training, mentoring, and defending workers who'd faced racial discrimination. Not a charity, not a nonprofit with vague intentions. A shield, and maybe in time, a sword. The headlines were still coming. But now, they had names other than hers. FBI launches. Full review of Officer Knox's record. Victims come forward with new allegations. Shady Grove PD faces federal oversight. Knox never issued a statement. His face, once full of swagger and uniform, was last seen in a grainy news clip, head down, walking briskly out of a courthouse. The same courthouse where he'd once dragged Diana to the floor. And Diana. She didn't gloat, didn't even smile. She stood at her office window one quiet evening, watching the city breathe below her, the courthouse tower in the distance. Protest signs faded but still resting along the railings. She held a cup of coffee she barely drank. Malcolm had texted her that morning, "You changed the law." But Diana didn't feel powerful. She didn't feel victorious. She felt tired, not in a defeated way, but in the way people feel when they've carried truth on their shoulders for too long. Someone knocked gently on her office door. It was Mara Collins. She held 2 folders fresh transcripts from another employee ready to testify. But she didn't speak right away. She just looked at Diana. "You all right?" Diana gave a small smile. "I'm okay. Just..." Hearing the quiet again. Mara tilted her head. "You missed the fight?" Diana shook her head. "No, I miss not needing one." Later that night, Diana sat alone on the center's rooftop garden. No press, no cameras, just her. And silence. She looked up at the stars, and for the first time in years they didn't feel so far away. They offered her $5 million, a number that could silence headlines, buy silence, package closure. It came in a crisp manila folder, hand-delivered by Elstra Media's executive council, with a polite smile and just the faintest flicker of desperation in her eyes. It wasn't just about the money. They were also offering a formal apology, written, signed, notarized. Their wording was careful. "We regret any unintentional harm. We strive to learn. We thank Ms. Ellis for her courage." The offer was, as they put it, a step forward. But Diana Ellis didn't blink. She didn't take the folder, didn't even reach for it. She looked across the table and said gently but firmly, "I don't want your money. I want your system to change." The room fell silent. Even Malcolm, seated beside her, looked over, half proud, half stunned. "Diana," he whispered, "it's $5 million. She turned to him. No anger, no doubt. $5 million won't fix the next woman they silence. That same afternoon, Diana submitted her counter-proposal. Not in legalese, but in plain terms. One Elstra must establish a permanent fund called Justice Forward to support whistleblowers and employees facing racial discrimination across all industries, not just media. 2. A 5-year internal program must be created to train all executives and managers in anti-bias practices monitored by third-party oversight. 3 annual public reports on diversity hiring and internal complaints must be published transparently. No cash, no severance, no personal gain, just a blueprint to prevent what happened to her from happening again. The board at Elstra took 48 hours to deliberate. By day 2, national pressure made the decision for them. News outlets ran with the headline, "Ellis turns down millions, demands reform instead." Social media exploded. To Justice Forward was trending globally. It was no longer about Diana Ellis, the individual. It was about what she'd refused to become, another quiet payout. But the real shock came from Washington. The Department of Defense, following an internal review, issued what they called the Ellis Clause, a new protocol to protect civilian contractors and former employees who report unethical conduct related to national security. No more quiet reassignments, no more buried files, no more unspoken rules about not stirring the waters. Diana hadn't asked for it, but the system knew it had been stirred and this time watched. On the final day of the settlement hearing, the courtroom was unusually still. No media cameras inside, no sound but the occasional shuffle of papers or a throat being cleared. Judge Brenner, the new appointed judge, looked down at the official agreement. "This court acknowledges the mutually accepted terms," she said, her voice neutral. Then she turned to Diana. "Ms. Ellis, is there anything you wish to say on record before we adjourn?" Diana stood, and for the first time she looked not at the judge, but at the gallery, at the clerks, at the security officers, at the interns and quiet staff who'd watched it all unfold from the edges. She said simply, "I didn't win. I just lived my truth, and they couldn't bury it." Then she nodded once, sat down, and said nothing else. Outside the courthouse there were no balloons, no chanting crowds, no media circus. Just a group of everyday people, some holding signs, some holding silence. As Diana stepped out onto the steps, the crowd parted gently. And then came something rare. Applause. but not the kind you hear after a big win. It wasn't loud. It was steady, soft. The kind you hear in theaters when the final line lands so quietly, no one dares breathe right away. It was a thank you, not for what she'd said, but for not staying silent. Diana didn't wave, didn't raise her fist. She just closed her eyes for a second and breathed. Then walked down the steps like someone who had nothing more to prove and everything left to give. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Diana sat at the table, a mug of tea warming her palms. Across from her, her daughter tapped on a laptop, brows furrowed. She was 12, bright, sharp, and already learning that the world didn't always listen the first time. "Mom," the girl said, hesitating, "can you read this before I send it?" Diana leaned forward, her eyes scanning the screen. It was an email to the school board. Polite, clear, firm. One of her classmates had been punished for wearing her natural hair in braids, called a disruption in front of the class. Her daughter wasn't asking for punishment, she was asking for respect. Diana smiled softly. "Change the second sentence, it'll land stronger. But the rest," she tapped the keyboard lightly. "You said it better than I could." And in that small moment in a quiet kitchen far from any courtroom, justice grew roots again. Somewhere downtown, Lieutenant Knox sat in a suit that no longer fit like armor. The state's police oversight board was holding its final hearing on use of force policy. Knox wasn't there to speak. He was there to listen. Across from him sat a woman he once shoved in a hallway, a man he once threatened during a traffic stop, and the video of him dragging Diana from the courtroom, it now played on a monitor behind them without sound. That silence stung more than any word. Knox didn't argue, didn't flinch. He bowed his head, not as a gesture of apology, but as someone who had finally run out of excuses. At home, Diana watched the broadcast in silence. She didn't smile, didn't nod. She simply turned to her daughter, who sat curled up beside her, and said quietly, "Sometimes, silence is the only thing they're not prepared for." Change didn't arrive in grand speeches or headlines anymore. It arrived in positions filled differently. Emails answered faster and doors that didn't shut so quickly. Mara Collins, the former anonymous whistleblower who once trembled handing over internal emails, was now the new director of talent at Elstra Media. She was the first black woman to hold that title. On her first day, she removed the old plaque outside her office, hung a new one hand-painted by her niece. It read, "Be loud for the quiet ones." Liam never quite forgave himself, but he didn't sit in shame either. He transferred out of corporate law, took a pay cut, and signed on as a public defender representing those who never had the luxury of being believed. Every time he stepped into court, he thought of Diana, of how her voice, even in its stillest moments, made people see the truth differently. He never told her that. He didn't need to. Some gratitude isn't meant to be spoken, only lived. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Diana sat by her window with a pen in hand. She was reviewing a funding request, a group of former bank employees preparing to file a class action lawsuit against a long-standing pattern of racial discrimination in promotions. The paperwork was thick, the details heavy. But her signature at the bottom, that meant more than money. It meant someone believed them. She signed it, then folded the letter neatly, placing it back in the envelope. She didn't speak at conferences, didn't write a memoir. She wasn't interested in becoming a brand. What Diana Ellis left behind wasn't noise, it was momentum. It was the idea that doing the right thing didn't always look loud, that sometimes the boldest stance is refusing to scream when they expect you to. It was the echo of truth, passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, victim to advocate, silence to system. That night her daughter went to bed early, and Diana stood alone in the kitchen again, her tea long since cold. She looked out into the night, not searching for something, but feeling it. That strange, unshakable sense that somewhere, somehow, someone had just spoken up. Because she once didn't sit down. Final frame black screen. White text. They tried to silence her, but her silence rewrote the system. Diana's story is a reminder that silence can be powerful and standing for truth can change everything. She didn't fight for fame. She fought for fairness. And in doing so, she lit a path for others. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful journeys like this. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter, stories that remember, stories that resist, and stories that echo long after the screen fades. This is Mr. Mac's Stories, where every voice counts.